Jake, I want to start with you. And a question I often ask editors when they're co-editing on a project is those early meetings, the things they discuss at the beginning of the project, how they're going to work together, how they're going to collaborate, what the process will be. Obviously, you were the sole editor on this, but working with the sound team, do you have discussions with the sound team early on to talk about, again, your process, the film itself, how are you going to treat the different sonic elements? What kind of things do you guys talk about?
We got Willie in really, I think it was just after it was a good, it was a director's, I mean, it's sort of, was it before the director's cut or around about the, no, it was before the director's cut. Really for the studio. Anyway, it was we got them in pretty early on in the edit and talked conceptually about stuff and just showed them before they saw the whole film, they saw scenes and sequences and they were working on things really early on, which then informed where we need to lean into the stuff. So sometimes, I think it was quite late on, we cut a bit out, which really upset Lee and because the sound was so cool, we removed and that was the tail wagging the dog. But it was good to have that back and forth. But no, I mean, we always knew that sound was going to be such a huge part of it. And to some extent, the legacy of it meant that we kind of knew where a lot of it was going to be light-ish, but at the same time, it was always really vital that we kind of knew where our strengths were going to lie and so the dialogue started, really quite early and the first scene the guys showed us really gave us so much confidence, which where they'd really put a lot of time into cutting it together was the Corbellon taking off and going into space for the first time, and the rest of the movie sounded like a crappy stereo offline. And then we had this one sequence with incredible sort of Hollywood heft that made the teeth shake and we put it in our little mini theater we had the cutting room, and we got so excited. It was first day, it felt like a real Hollywood movie. So we and then from that point on, it was a kind of a constant exchange and dialogue. And apart from driving the guys crazy with constant changes, so they had to keep reconforming the whole time, which I think was the bane of all of their lives. But Fede's never one to sit on a new idea, which he has constantly right up into the wire. So, and ultimately, it's our job to facilitate. So yeah, we made it work.
Well, I'm glad you used the term tail wagging the dog, because I think for a lot of people that are just starting to learn about the film process or don't know much about the film process, and by a lot of people, I mean me, obviously, that distinction between picture and sound, like where one begins, that the recursive nature of it, especially when we get into temping, it's like, obviously you start in the very beginning with picture, but where typically, Lee, is the sound team brought in? What are the first things that you're working on with the picture department?
Well, it kind of, it's a case-by-case basis, depending on the show. For Romulus, they had us kind of do some conceptual stuff even before the shoot. So we created a bunch of different ship backgrounds, and we're just kind of, spitballing about what we think things are going to look like based off of the script. But we also knew that, it needed to feel like 79, like the original movie. So we sent that stuff off, and I believe they played some of that stuff on set as kind of reference, right?
I completely forgotten that. Yeah, that's right. They did. He was very conscious that he wanted the actor, because they were shooting on a sound stage, but he wanted the actors to be projecting to a suitable level, because he didn't want them, people have a tendency to, would talk very quietly if the set's very quiet. And he had very conscious that the ship was going to be making these big, dirty industrial ships going to be making a loud noise. So he got the guy that he literally would play exactly what was going to be the sound of the ship really loudly, and then cut the sound just before the take. But they hopefully knew to speak over it, which works sometimes. And
that was an idea that came out of our initial meeting with Fede. It was just supposed to be kind of like, a first meet and greet, see if we want to work together kind of thing. And it very quickly turned into a spotting session, basically, for the shoot, and talking about, what could be done on set to help the actors, like Jake was saying, help the actors understand not only what these environments were going to feel like, but also the energy level. And we talked a lot about how David Fincher shot the club scenes in The Social Network, and how he would basically play super loud, like club level loud music in the real club that they were shooting in, until right before the actors started talking, so that they would get acclimated to what that energy level in the room actually felt like. So we sent a bunch of stuff to Fede, and we're working with the production sound mixer to basically have material that they could play back on set that would be not only evocative, but also, like logical, like it would help the actors sort of put themselves in that place.
Well, Polly, I think you're the first dialogue editor I've had on the podcast, and other than Nina Hartstone, probably the first dialogue editor I've ever interviewed. And you have a really impressive CV, as they call it. Lord of the Rings to District 9 to Ford versus Ferrari, Stranger Things. Before we dig further into Alien Romulus, I'd love to find out from you, what are the qualities of a good dialogue editor, and what is it about that role that you enjoy so much?
Well, that's a big question. A good dialogue editor.
I only asked the big ones.
Yeah, sure. Well, I honestly think most of the time, my job is to get out of the way so the sound design can shine, right? And that was certainly true on this one. I came on pretty early on to do a massive, big cleanup of the production audio because it was pretty noisy and pretty gnarly. I think I was on before you guys, right? In terms of like...
Yeah, I think you started a week or two before us.
Yeah. And so I was, sending some cleaned up dialogue to Jake for the Avid so they could cut without getting their heads blown off by the noisy production. So that, I really felt like I was just trying to get out of the way. And then beyond that, I sort of think, I'm just protecting and preserving actors' performances. They bust their asses in their performances, and the less we can loop, better, right?
It's funny, Polly's saying, keep it out of the way, but what she's so good at is making sure that it actually stays anchored in the film. Her and Mark Patterson worked really hard to try to clean up as much as they could of these messy, because so much was done practically, right? So we wanted to preserve not only the sounds from the set, but also the performances. So a lot of the work that they did was to make things as clear as possible so that we could build this whole world around the characters. And so in my view, Polly's work and Mark's work is actually much more about bringing all those performances in the way, if you will, but in a way that leaves us room to do what we're trying to do.
Well, the film slots in between Alien and Aliens, 20 years after Alien, I believe, to be more precise. I watched both of those films immediately prior to watching Alien Romulus, which I definitely recommend because it's so much. It was great to have all that fresh in your mind, especially with a lot of the callbacks that you do. But putting aside any Easter eggs, which we'll definitely get to, what did Fede say about how he wanted to either connect to or depart from either of those two iconic films?
Well, I met Fede via Zoom, and after the initial 20 minutes of sort of friendly chit chat about kids and whatever, obviously pretty much his first question was, so, would you like the Alien movies? And I went on at some length about how, seminal, specifically because of my generation, Aliens was my kind of entry point. And then I went back to Alien eventually when I was a bit older, but I was about 10 when I started watching Aliens pretty much on a weekly basis. It was one of my first VHSs I ever had the actual store-bought copy of. So for me, it was like right into that kind of childhood, the reason why you wanted to make films in the first place kind of thing. And I've never, I've made a lot of films I'm very proud of in my career, but none of them tap into that kind of childish or that, the kind of inception point for your love of cinema. So, it was a sort of, there wasn't even a question about, did I want to do it or was I excited by it or, did it feel like something I wanted to explore? And I'm going to have I think Fede came to me via my association with Alex Garland, but I don't have a history of making horror movies at all. I've done a few things that are in the sort of spooky arena, but it wasn't a really obvious, it wasn't like I was the guy who does those kind of movies. So I was thrilled and kind of surprised that he, even initially, wanted to take the meeting, and then even more surprised when I got the job. But I was, and in terms of what he wanted to do with it, he was talked about, of course he wanted to be completely referential to and respectful of those films, but then also, he said, but there's nothing we can do but to stop ourselves making this film in the 21st century. And we are going to be bringing modern new techniques and things they can do before, and just we won't be able to help ourselves. but it's always going to also just constantly reference back. So it was kind of this exciting, nostalgic / new hybrid, proposition, which felt like as Lee already said, a dream job.
Yeah, for us, it started with our first meeting with Fede. We walked into his office and it was completely littered with alien fandom nerd stuff. And so Lee and I felt right at home immediately. And that kind of kicked off the conversation because there was some kind of deep cut stuff around. And Lee's the biggest alien fan I know. And I thought I was a big alien fan. So the conversation very quickly devolved into alien fandom. And what we loved about those, especially the first two films and a lot of not only the sounds themselves, but the choices that were made in the mix and, a lot of the boldness that's there in those first two films. And Lee can talk more about, sort of the specific homages and the specific Easter eggs that we placed throughout the film. But one of the biggest compliments we've gotten so far is that a lot of people assume that most of the sound is taken directly from the original films, but it's not. Like 99% of it is stuff that we've created from scratch, but in the spirit of the original films. So we spent a lot of time with Fede talking about how do we, living in that world, like going back to that world, specifically this place that's between the two films, and how do we kind of, sonically inhabit that space again.
When I first heard that they were going to make another Alien movie, you're kind of like apprehensive because there's never a bad Alien movie, but the last few necessarily haven't been, my favorite. And then when he started talking to Will and I, it's like every single thing that you'd want the director to say, the dude said, and we just walked out. We like skipped out of the meeting, we were so stoked on it. And then back to, what Will was saying about being in the spirit of 79 and all that. I got texts this morning from people, like, oh, that's so cool that you, reused all the sounds. And I'm like, we didn't, so I'm like, I don't know how to feel about it. I think it's a compliment. But it probably is because we tried so hard to get it in the pocket to where it sounded like it came from the original movies. A great example of that was, at the very beginning when this Echo probe turns on, it really harkens back to the Nostromo booting up for the first time. 99% of the stuff that's in there is all, brand new stuff from scratch. But our whole goal was, for just the random nerd to come off the street that's like, oh, that sounds exactly like the original movie. So I was really proud on the crew. I think everybody did a really great job at trying to recapture that spirit from the originals.
On that subject, can we talk about the tape saturation thing?
Oh yeah,
I was going to say,
I literally just got a text this morning about it from a friend of mine at Skywalker, basically saying it felt like the whole thing felt like it was recorded on tape. Like, was it recorded on tape? And of course it wasn't. Everything was recorded digitally, including the picture. But just as much as Fede was interested in having a filmic look for the picture, we also spent a lot of time talking about having an analog sound, a tape sound for the sound, because we really wanted to embrace, again, that feeling of 79 and, looking at what exactly does that mean, and analyzing it. And we did a little experiment at one point with Fede where he was like, let's try taking reel 1 and make it literally sound like 79. And so we put up the first reel of 79 on the stage, and we listened to it and we realized, like, wow, it's basically like there's that much bandwidth, there's no highs, there's no lows. It's distorted to hell. And it's compressed to hell, and everything you wouldn't necessarily ever want to do to a soundtrack, especially in 2024. But it had a thing, it had feeling, right? And so we started reverse engineering it and applying various layers of analog saturation and distortion and tape emulation plugins and that sort of thing, multiple layers really.
Which at one point just about gave me an emotional breakdown because we went so far with it, right? And I was like, "No, you can't do it."
Poor Polly thought we were going to be stuck with it because we really did. I mean, we did the all the way version, and I turned around and Polly's just like, "Ah, I can't
Suddenly all
release
this
it like this.
beautiful dialogue's just starting. No. But what
Yeah.
I did learn from that is like, it's okay to experiment, right? Like you can push
Mhm.
things real far and then come back, which is what we did ultimately.
Yeah. And that's one thing that we learned about working with Fede, and Jake, I'm sure you had the same experience, was that a lot of times he just wants to try stuff, and it's like the fastest way to figure it out is just try it, like don't try to reason your way around it or whatever. Just like dive in, both feet, and if it's going to sound crazy, let's make it sound crazy, and then figure out if there's anything we like about it. And what we learned in that process was this is way too far. No modern audience would accept this. We're losing so much. But what we did walk away with was that there's a certain energy and a certain feeling in hearing the voices, especially distort a little, like saturate, really, not distort, but saturate when they scream. In that way that 70s movies, technically they could just only carry so much signal. So at a certain point, a scream would just kind of clip, but it would clip in a nice analog way, which just gave it more drama and actually kind of in a way lets it not be as loud. So the whole film is smothered in various layers of analog tape saturation. But I think it's one of the things that really contributes to the overall vibe.
You didn't reuse most of the sounds from the originals. You did kind of, in a way, reuse a voice. Obviously, by now, anybody that's either seen the film or has read up a little bit about it knows about Ian Holmes in the film, which is a challenge because Ian Holmes passed away. But you've brought him back for this as the character Rook. Why don't we start with you, Jake, and just how that character was created and how you built that up in editorial?
Yeah, so I mean, it's worth maybe saying that the script I read, it was just another synthetic character who was kind of off. The whole I'm going to bring back Ian Holm was something that didn't even get written. I mean, it was something Fede told me about a week before they started shooting that, I'm doing this, but that wasn't how it was written at all. It was a complete sort of, as is Fede's sort of creative want, we joke that his tendency is always to put a hat on a hat. And he always he goes, I've got this thing and it's a kind of cool idea, but how about if we also do this? And then he was like, and then this as well. And anyway, so turning him into Ian Holm was kind of one of those thoughts. But then in terms of the practicality of shooting it, Fede's original, hope was that because they built a very complex animatronic puppet, which was on set. So 99% of the image you see of the character on set is a real thing that was filmed on the day. With a pre-programmed performance. So we'd shot the actor who was giving us the line readings previously, and Fede would selected a performance, which was then sort of built into the puppet that it could deliver on cue. So it was there. It could give the responses to a bespoke timing, but it could only give one set of responses. But it was on set, giving the actors who were on set something to work with. So again, in the spirit of the film, it wasn't a couple of tennis balls or anything. There was this character on set, which you could see, and was giving us sort of a performance. And Fede really, when he even came into the edit after the shoot, saying, all I want to do is replace the eyes. And we were going, hey, Anyway, we started going down that path, but eventually it became a lot more involved than that. But editorially, from my point of view, it was a fairly stiff performance. It was like working with a not great actor. Basically, but I've had a few of them over the years. So but editorially, that was the challenge editorially was to try and create a bit more energy off, because the actors in the room weren't really playing off him. So you try and compress overlap make some of the responses a little more fluid. But no, for my, as an editorial challenge, it really wasn't, the onus wasn't on me particularly. It was it really got complex when it became the VFX team visually, and then really Polly and the guys having to do the sound with the vocal thing.
The vocal thing. Okay, Polly, the vocal thing. That's a big non-question. How'd you do the vocal thing?
How did we do the vocal thing? Well, so we knew we needed to build a digital model of Ian Holmes' voice. So we used Respeecher. And it it was interesting and tricky because obviously building an AI voice model of an actor who's passed away, it's controversial. It was done obviously with the complete blessing and permission of the Ian Holm estate, but it was also, we were doing this in the middle of the strikes, and this is one of the fundamental issues, right? So it's a sensitive issue, and it did mean we were really limited in what we could use to create that model. So Respeecher, to build a voice model, they need around 2 hours of a voice to create this digital model, and we were limited to the Alien film universe to get that audio from. So initially we went through the old movie. I think Smokey, the assistant, went through the 79 and got out all the little bits of Ian Holm's performance that we could. I think it was something like 7 minutes or 20. So it was not 2
I
hours.
think it was 8.
Was it 8 minutes?
And once we cut out all the other characters and the overlaps and the noisy bits, it was
Yeah.
about 8 minutes.
Yeah. So we sent this off to Respeecher, and they tried to make a model out of that. And they sort of came back and went, it's not really, not the 2 hours we need. So one of the really fun things we eventually got permission to do was to go back to the old tapes, like the old reels from
Like the production dailies.
the
from
production
set on
dailies
Nagra.
from 79. And what was the guy's name? Do you remember the name of the production mixer? He had a cool name.
Oh
Anyway.
yeah, he had a great name. Matt, we'll send you we have a picture of one of the reels and the sound reports from the archive. And
Yeah.
it's, what was his name? Leathers, something Leathers. or
Something.
like
It was
that.
something leathers.
He
It
sounded
Yeah.
super cool.
Yeah.
was very macho.
Apparently, it
But
was his
yeah.
last film.
Yes. Yeah, right. So we digitized these old tapes, and we still didn't have enough, but we had
Well,
a lot more.
Remember the whole mystery around it, because basically we couldn't figure out. So we found out that they did have the dailies in the salt mine somewhere, and they were willing to pull some of them for us and digitize some of them, but they didn't want to commit to digitizing the entire film because it was hundreds of tape reels. So they were like, well, why don't we do like 20? And so then we had to try to figure out, okay, well, which reels would have had Ian Holm on them? And so we found a script, and we're like, okay, we have to find a line script so we can see, which scenes had Ash, and then we can work backwards from there. But then we found out that back then in England, they didn't number shots the same way that we do now. So
Yes, British Street, where you
Yeah.
just count. It's just the
yeah,
shit.
it's just the first shot of the first day that's shot one, and then you just go from there. Whereas like in America, it's the style, it's more organized, I guess, where it's like around the scene, right? So it's like scene 23, take A, shot A, shot B, shot C. So it's much easier to tell what setup corresponds to what scene. And the only way we finally figured out, someone found, it was Claire, our post coordinator, found a video in the archive that had a bunch of takes on it that weren't in the film, that had gone to marketing or something, and they had Ash in them. And based on that, we could figure out roughly which numbers might have Ash on them. And so that was our like Rosetta Stone. So basically Claire and Polly had to like do this whole like Dora the Explorer situation just to figure out which tapes to even digitize.
When I was watching the film, the opening of the film, there's a pan over the ship in silence, not true silence, but just quiet.
It's pretty silent, other than the popcorn. Well, it would be digital silence except for the fact that we have analog tape noise running under the entire film. So
Okay, well, therein lies my point, because that shot or that section reminded me of you, Will, because of course all roads lead to Will.
silence doesn't usually respond. That's not my thing usually.
No, but so for Ghostbusters Afterlife, I remember you talking about going back and I'll say listening, not watching, listening to the original Ghostbusters and studying the noise floor, I think you did.
Mhm.
And it's like that level of detail that goes into these things. Now hearing you talk about going back to the old reels and things like that. Since it was inspired by Will, I'll ask Lee, I mean, is that is that standard operating procedure to go back, I guess specifically in a franchise environment, and really just study all the little individual audio elements, sonic elements from those previous films?
I think that's, it depends on the project. That was, very appropriate for Ghostbusters. Sure as hell was appropriate for Alien, especially if, you're trying to recapture the spirit of it all. We kept talking about the Echo probe turning on is very similar to the Nostromo turning on, and, to the point that people are thinking we're kind of reusing the same sounds. But I was thinking about that this morning, and a lot of that is, we were able to go back through the original stems, and we built a show library from Alien and Aliens, but it was more of like a reference library. It wasn't so much like we're just going to pepper this throughout. We didn't want the job to turn into like a copy paste thing. We wanted to, bring a new spin to it, but also have it feel old. And, I think one of the reasons that Echo probe sequence works is because while the sounds are new, it's matching a lot of the same rhythms that were in the Nostromo boot up, so if the beep does this, the beep does this as well, but it's a new sound, maybe it goes down in pitch. So we tried to match a lot of the shape of the original sounds, if that, makes sense. We have this siren that got featured all through the last reel, and it's very similar to classic trailer siren that's been in the trailers forever. And it's very close because it's, the same length, it's kind of matching the same types of pitch, so it kind of gets it very close without being super derivative.
Yeah, we didn't want to use
That
the
answer your
actual
question?
sound. If it
No.
felt like that was a bridge too far. That was
Yeah.
like, that would be a little too cute to use the actual sound. But we wanted to make a sound that was evocative and felt very similar.
Yeah, it felt, felt like I was like cheating or cheap to, reuse the sounds, because it was such a privilege to even be able to be in this world that you still wanted to be able to leave your own footprint,
Yeah. Well, in terms of telling the story itself, yes, there are homages, tributes, callbacks, whatever you want, to the originals, but not a lot of time spent, if any, really going into the backstory. Jake, in that first 10 minutes, we get right into what it is. We set up that Rain's got to get off this rock. She's an indentured servant in the mining colony and just wants to get out of there. Not too much backstory on what's going on here. Was there ever any thought to doing more of that, either through VO or text, anything like that?
Not exactly, because we do have the sort of pre-title sequence, which always kind of threw off our rhythms in terms of, well, it made the challenge even greater to kind of get, because we kind of knew that we kind of had to get them onto the ship within 20 minutes in terms of the sort of classic first reel structure. And yet we were starting sort of 5 minutes behind the 8 ball because of this, quite slow, quite languid pre-title, which we all loved, and we didn't want to diminish that at all, which is the only bit that actually directly links to which is the discovery of the wreckage of the Nostromo and picking up the Xeno cocoon and so that's the cool one. But in terms of the Rain storyline, that doesn't have any correlate. Other than, feeling like it's a similar environment to LB-426 and the Aliens movie. But as always, it was a huge challenge of the movie to get to. We've got to set up 5-6 brand new characters and the sort of their probably their need to get off this rock, and which has motivated the whole narrative. And one of the things we struggled with most, which we didn't see coming, was in our early test screenings, people were like, "Hey, what's so wrong with the colony? It seems fine." I was down there for
Where'd you screen this movie?
Well, it's funny, the Sacramento.
Oh, well, okay, that makes sense.
No, it was we didn't foresee it, but it was something we had to go back and really we re-engineered some shots. We changed certain backgrounds to sort of make Rain's life seem less comfortable. We did so much work with sort of ADR to sort of make the environment feel. Anyway, it was a huge. That first sort of 10 minutes on the colony was probably the most worked 10 minutes in the movie, as is usually the case, and also just to compress it as much as possible, because you are setting up so much, and yet we all know that it's not the bit that the audience have come here to see. The sort of necessary. That's always the way with kind of setting up the it's like eating your greens. You have to do it, but everyone's like, let's get to the monsters, get to the scary bit. But so it was a challenge to do that, and it was always just don't outstay our welcome, but we've also got to establish this world and the stakes for the characters and get a, at least a small insight into each of them. So that was the challenge.
It's funny that Jake said that because my parents went to go see it this weekend, and the very first thing my dad talked to me about, man, that planet they lived on was terrible, and it's like, I'd want to get off that thing. I'm like, that's interesting you mentioned that because, so I gave him kind of the backstory, but like, oh, we nailed it, because we needed to sell the fact that they've got to get off this route. So that cracked me up when he said that first thing.
Which is actually a sort of direct contradiction to Cameron's version of, Cameron's alluded to LV-46 before the aliens turn up. Looks like it's all cute high school photos and kind of like, it's like some 1950s America, but in space. So I think, that's the place where we're kind of slightly contradicting, canon exactly. But, maybe a mining colony is different to whatever they were doing.
Well, I think it's a testament to the pacing that you get right to the goal. You get the movie going very quickly, but the first real scare doesn't come until like 40 minutes into the film.
I think it's pretty close to exactly where it is, where the thing, where John Hurt gets got in Alien. I mean, Fede was always checking. We had the films digitized into the Avid, and we were every now and then, not to be slavish, we weren't sort of copying ways to cut things or anything, but just to kind of check, okay, are we being ridiculously slow for the, for the franchise? And no, I think pretty much we hit exactly where it was about 30 minutes. The bit where Rooks grabs Rain's arm, which is really the first jump scare. That's pretty exactly where John Hurt gets.
That's very funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking one of the things I wanted to ask was, do you feel this is we're always talking about being in the middle of Alien and Aliens. Does this feel stylistically to you more like one or the other?
Well, that's the thing. And that's sort of what, the extent that, there's been a lot of people noticing how referential the film is, but I don't know how many people have sort of really got which, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't get it for a while, which is that literally the conceit of the film is, in Fede's mind, is the first, there's two halves of the space station. And when they cross from one, even the design of the space station is the one half, the one they land on originally, the Remus side, is essentially mimicking designs from Alien. And then when they cross to the other side, a lot of different time, it sort of becomes Aliens. But also the movie changes the horror elements, such as they are, happen mostly in the first half of the movie. And this horror is cutting rhythm is much slower, much more like Alien. But once you get into the sort of actual action of the acid clouds and the decompression, you have to cut faster because it's action, and the drama being told is action beats, not horror beats. So the movie is sort of moves from one to the other in a kind of completely intrinsic way that you can't. That was sort of baked into Fede's intention with the screenplay and then the design, and so it does. It is two movies in one, and that's sort of very much baked into it.
I would like to remind you that this podcast is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Extreme Music. When you need the very best, most inspiring production audio out there for your next film or TV show, they are the only name you need to know. You can search through their enormous catalog of tracks using keywords based on composer, genre, mood, tempo, even lyrics. Or you can upload a reference track to Extreme Music and they will find you ones just like it. What you get back is top-shelf music from the incredible musicians and composers that make up their A-list roster of talent. You can get your tracks in different links, and you can even use their stem mixer tools to dial in just the instruments or vocals you want from that track. You can even do all the licensing right there online, or with a little help from one of their friendly reps from around the world. So the next time you've got a story to tell, make it sing with production audio from Extreme Music. We'll talk a lot of times about manipulating an audience with a jump scare, the way you do it visually. Sonically, creating a jump scare, the elements behind what a jump scare is, because so much of it is the sound. When you guys are building a jump scare, because it's not a diegetic sound. It is something that isn't really there. How do you go about building something like that? And in your minds, what are the raw elements of a jump scare sonically?
Fede took us to school on this.
That's right.
Yeah, and I'm sure Jake can talk about this too, but Fede shared with us his theory of jump scares. And I hope I'm not giving away state secrets here. But it's one of those things that as soon as he said it, we were all kind of like, oh my God, it's so simple, but it's so true. And it's basically, the formula is get the audience to be tense, and then give them a reason to exhale. And then just as they're at the bottom of that exhale, that's when you hit them. And if you don't give the audience a chance to let their guard down and exhale, like physically, you want the audience to kind of then hold it, and then you get hit, right? And if you don't have the chance to let them down, the scare will never hit them the same way. So once he shared that with us, and he obviously had built that with Jake in a lot of these moments, we were able to kind of use the same tactic with sound to, kind of pull the bow back and then do a fake out, and then you let it go.
And what about the actual elements themselves? What are the stems of a jump scare?
It's sharp sounds that always does it. There's a couple times in the movie when like there's loud spark sounds. Those are great for jump scares. I mean, Lee's really good at hiding weird, vocal shrieks or whatever inside of other sounds. So they feel plausible, but they still have that effect on your psyche. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, for me, it's usually a high frequency sound.
Yeah. And we never really, Will can probably speak to this as well. I don't think we ever really went to that whole grab bag of just using stinger sounds and things like that. Everything was very natural. Jake did such a great job selling the jump scares that I almost feel like we didn't have a lot to do, because he had already carried the cross so much on that stuff. So I'm thinking like, when the face huggers jump on the windows, Tyler comes up and slams on the windows. It's just, like Will said, higher, sharp sounds, but none of it's like kind of your traditional, sting type stuff.
Well, yeah, we were cheating a little bit, but Fede was always very, if it was too forced, there was a few times where the first draft of in the final mix, there was a huge bass hit that felt like it was filmmakers, nothing, and we were trying to sort of find the sweet spot between embellished, naturalistic sounds that are earned by the movie or what's happening in the frame, rather than, nothing was allowed to be too contrived, or too exaggerated. But yeah, as with everything, it was a kind of diving one way, and then so what's too far, what's too cheap. But it has to be as impactful as possible.
Well, Polly, earlier you were talking about getting out of the way. Like as a dialogue editor, I'm just trying to get out of the way. I would almost think it would be more you're trying to get them out of the way in certain circumstances, because there's so much, when you're building up so much sonically and there's a lot of action going on, a lot of noise going on, but you're still trying for the audience to clock certain key things that are being said. Does that make it more challenging for you to find space in there when there's so much going on from a sonic landscape?
I would say that's really more of a challenge for Mark Patterson, who was a dialogue mixer. And that is the process of mixing, right? Like the dialogue has to play. You need to hear the lines. Things have got to dip and duck around them sometimes. And sometimes it's okay for things not to be completely clear. It's making that call. But yeah, that's a constant process. Balancing dialogue, sound effects, and music, and figuring out what's the hero in any given moment.
Mixing is largely just a sort of sonic magic trick. It's sort of trying to convince the audience they're hearing everything at the same time, because you can't. You can only really hear like 2 or 3 things at the same time. So you're constantly, taking things away and saying, okay, now hear this thing. Okay, now hear this thing. And obviously the dialogue is always going to be the anchor. So we largely build the scenes around the dialogue, but luckily Polly's so skilled at cleaning the dialogue up to help the clarity without making it sound processed. That's a big part of modern dialogue editing, and it's really easy to go too far with that. And we didn't want this movie to sound clean. We wanted it to sound gritty. But we had a bunch of Cockney accents and, other challenges, people, in real water, like on real sets with real, space and everything. So we had a lot of challenges. But I hope people can hear most of the dialogue, at least the dialogue we wanted them to hear.
I'm just going to be honest, and with all due respect to our lone Brit and our dialogue editor, I was so glad when Bjorn died. I couldn't understand a damn thing he said.
He was the problem from this. I mean, not a problem. It was definitely a thing that everybody noticed at the beginning, was like that his accent's very thick, and what do we do with that?
You kill him off first. That's what you do.
Well, it's also just his character, and so often things are implied. I think, you know, you get the gist of where he's coming from.
No, Fede made a point. I mean, I think he felt more strongly than the studio, or possibly a lot of us, that, you know, he doesn't mind when the audience don't hear. And also, I think, you know, the fact that he's grew up in Uruguay watching films where he wasn't necessarily following all the dialogue, you know, I think, and also there's huge chunks of the film where there isn't very much dialogue. I mean, a lot of there's, you know, several 10, 20, 15-minute sequences in the film where it's actually all just being told in pictures. So you know, it's, but yeah, where, you know, it was his own exposition that he was, you know, he never really minded if we could do it or not.
And that was definitely a thing. Like, my instinct is to, okay, we're going to look at all this guy's lines and get him in, because, you know, my job is to make sure you can understand the dialogue. But you know, it was like the experimenting with the tape saturation thing. Sometimes it's okay to, you know, it doesn't all have to be perfect. And we ended up doing very little technical ADR.
The Bjorn thing's interesting because, like, I get, you know, the comments on people not being able to hear his lines and everything, but you don't need to hear all of his lines to know that he's a dick.
Right,
you know?
exactly.
And,
That's a much more succinct way of putting it.
That comes across perfectly.
Yeah.
You know,
You do something in the film as storytellers to create tension, which is a mechanism that is often employed. Now it's a clock. You set out right away, like, okay, we have 36 hours. And then the shuttle crashes in the docking bay of, I guess, was it the Remus? I'm not sure which side they were on, but yeah. And all of a sudden it's like, nope, now we have like 48 minutes before the ship crashes, or the station crashes into the outer ring of the planet. So you've established with the audience, like, clock's running. And so you always have to have that in the back of your mind, certainly as an editor, that, okay, does this feel like this amount of action could take place in that amount of time? Was that something, again, it helps you in terms of creating tension, but it's also, it binds you a little bit in terms of how you can pace the story. Do you feel that in editorial?
Yeah, I was very conscious of it. And there are certain, I mean, really, in terms of the sort of, you know, there are problems one can fix, there are problems one can't fix. And one of the things that, if one digs down into it too hard, one of the sort of challenges of that, which was unsolvable, which was just baked into the script, which is that it does put a clock on the xenomorph's mutation time, which has always been a sort of gray area in any previous, you know, you're suddenly going, okay, so it goes from being the thing that bursts out of the chest to a full-grown xeno inside 25 minutes. You know, that is a challenge, but that was the one we could fix. But in terms of, could they cross from this place and do this? And I mean, it does stack up if you put it is about 40 minutes from when they say that to is slightly under. So, but of course, some of those are cheats, because there's bits there's a few time jumps and things here or there. So, but it's not too, you know, I was trying my best to keep it to be as plausible as it possibly could. And certainly one thing I felt very strongly is it couldn't possibly be longer. When they say, oh my God, there's only 47 minutes, I couldn't have the film be longer than 47 minutes from those 2 points. So it is less than, it's about 40 minutes from when they say to when it impacts. So other than the alien's genetic ability to turn itself from one state to another, there's nothing in there that's sort of too much of a cheat. But it was, you know, definitely, but again, it was sort of healthy to have, I mean, again, like the challenge, the note you always get under seeing is make it fast. You never, ever don't get that. And so one's always sort of got that, whether it's explicitly into the narrative of the film or not, there's always a kind of virtual clock running in every movie. And, but it kept us honest. And, it suddenly had this thing where right towards the end of the there was a full the station, we suddenly had this different clock, which was the clock of the gravity purge. And so we were sort of, sometimes we just do a visual cue. So rather than have the state have mother say 10 minutes to the asteroid collision, you just show the asteroids without a timestamp on it. So you're visually keeping that narrative alive without buying yourself into a timestamp. And so we were sort of jumping between, but there was a lot of competing sort of, a competing list of impending problems, and you solve one and then you jump there constantly. have to remind the audience, oh no, there's this, you fix that problem, but there's still this bigger looming problem. So sometimes it was a sonic solution, sometimes it was a visual solution. And we actually used our visual effect producer's voice as the voice of Mother. She said she'd always been told she sounds like a robot, and so we put it to the test.
Well, Will, between Star Trek and Star Wars and any number of other films, you're kind of an old hand at doing sound design in space. Jake was just talking about sort of in a roundabout way the rules of when I have these clocks and what do I have to adhere to. You're doing sound design in space. Do you even think about anything, or it's just this is my palette, I'm gonna go nuts and it's gonna sound awesome?
Well, every movie's a little different, right? And there's lots of different ways to approach space. And obviously we open the movie with silence, literal silence, right? So that set up the idea of like when we're outside, it's quiet. And what we realized though is that we didn't always want to play it completely silently, because we would have lost so many moments of scale, and excitement. So what we came up with was this idea that it was sort of inspired by the film Gravity, that the sounds you would hear out there would be, almost heard through your body, felt more than heard. So there's really, nothing above, I don't know, 100 hertz or something. I mean, it's a very, very low cutoff in terms of frequencies. But Lee cut all those sequences full range, full fidelity, and then I did that in the mix. And it's something that we started doing more and more as we, every temp mix we did, we kind of said, oh, let's see how far we can take this. And then when Jake cut that amazing sequence of the Corbelan crash landing into the Romulus hangar bay, we realized that was a place that we could, if we took sound away often completely again when we're outside, that it was just so much more dramatically effective. When the chest burster finally fully emerges and screams, we echo it out into silence, and you just see the ship drifting, and the audience, you can tell the audience just goes, oh, like, not only did this thing just burst out, but that ship is obviously drifting towards the side of this space station now. And I think that there's no sound we could have put in there that would have been more effective than leaving the audience alone with that feeling. And then, of course, it gave us great contrast when we bring the sound back in. So it was a way to kind of reset from, we had this whole sequence that kind of did this the whole time, and then we reset so that we could go back up again. And we're constantly looking for places in the film that we could have big sonic contrast. One of my favorite ones is when the Corbelan's first docking and the guys are all standing in the airlock, and you show the shot of the outside, and the ship kind of slowly, hits the airlock, and it looks all kind of majestic, and it's just a little, quiet thud kind of sound. Then we cut inside, and they're all kind of getting shaken around. It's all loud. And you go like, oh, that's probably actually what it would be like. Like, it looks from afar, it looks, sort of majestic and serene, but then, actually it's very heavy metal on the inside.
Usually I start off these interviews asking where, if it's just the editor, I ask, well, where did you cut? Were you actually on location at all? I think the film was shot in Budapest, so I don't think any of you were on location. If you were, I'd love to hear it. But where were each of you working to perform your duties for Alien Romulus?
I was allowed to assemble when they were shooting in Budapest. I was assembling from my home in the UK, so I was getting the daily sort of beam to me. And then as soon as the shoot was over, I went to LA for 11 months and was cutting there with Fede pretty much every day. And so that was, yeah.
Well, I did a lot of my work in this room right here. Polly's got the most exotic answer.
Well, sure. Yeah. So I did most of the dialogue edit from my home in New Zealand in a little town by the sea, middle of nowhere. And I came to LA every time we did a temp mix. So we all got together on the stage, and I came out for the final mix, obviously, as well.
Well, Polly, considering the nature of what you do, again, I would always assume, well, the sound team, they wouldn't necessarily be on location, but as the dialogue editor, a lot of times the picture editor's on location, so the director feels comfortable, like, yes, we got what we needed to get. Well, I would think the same would apply in terms of, yes, you can do ADR, but I would think it would make a lot of sense to have the dialogue editor there as well.
Maybe so, but the world has shrunk, like our crews are scattered all over the place. Most ADR, not just because I'm here in New Zealand a lot of the time, most ADR now is done over Zoom because we have actors all over the world by the time we get to post. So, we're zooming into the studios in London and Canada and more exotic places than that sometimes. And the internet's made that possible.
Yeah. And of course, the studios don't want to pay for us to be around during the shoot. So there's that, too.
Yeah.
But, we do sometimes get access to the dailies via Pix or, one of those streaming kind of things. And I think, we've all had certain films where they're worried about the dailies. They might loop us in early just to say, hey, what do you think about this? Do we need to address anything? Sometimes, like in this case, we did bring in Polly earlier than we had initially planned because there was some scenes that needed help more than we had anticipated. But yeah, Polly's right. It's like we're living in a world where we're all making movies together from around the world. I'm here in Silver Lake in Los Angeles, and Lee is in Burbank right now, and our shop is in Burbank. And then we all came together at Glen Glen in Hollywood to mix the film. So that was, kind of our home base through a lot of, at least the sound post-production. We did all the temps there and we did the final there. But it was one of these things where not only was it fun to all be mixing on the stage together, but, we got to see Polly. Polly would come to town for those weeks. So that was always fun.
Before I let you go, there is one scene I wanted to talk about, and whether this was one of the scenes that needed help or not. It is the scene where Rain and Andy and what the other characters, Tyler, they're going in. They have to walk through this corridor that's filled with, I guess they call them face huggers, which sounds vaguely pornographic.
This whole movie is more than vaguely pornographic, by the way.
I knew I could count on you to point that out, Will. But the gist of it is they have to raise the temperature of the room up to their body temperature because the face huggers detect based on sound and body temperature. The characters are walking through this, feels like a tunnel, and it is an immersive experience. And in that instance, that's where I noticed sort of the Atmos being dialed up a bit. Like you could feel the little noises all around you. There's certain scenes where you look at this and say, okay, this demands more of a surround experience. And here I'm going to be a little more, for lack of a better term, stereo.
Mm-hmm. One big realization we made at one point with that sequence you're talking about, the facehugger sequence, is we had initially built all these vocal sounds for those facehuggers as well. So that when they were, perched on the little thing over here, they'd be, making a little sound. And what we realized was that the facehuggers are much scarier if they don't have a vocal, if it's just about their body movements. So we try to pass of basically stripping out all the vocal sounds from that sequence. And suddenly the sequence got so much scarier because it was it made it feel like the facehuggers were listening, and all we were hearing was the tiny little sound of their tail moving or their joints popping or whatever. And it made us hold our breath more. And we realized, oh, well, it was definitely a less is more kind of situation. And we couldn't help ourselves. We're sound people. So we put sounds on it. Right. And then we realized that if we just took all those sounds out, that suddenly the scene got so much scarier. It was definitely one of those sequences where we sort of artificially raised the sound of the backgrounds, almost like almost like automatic gain control on a camera. It's like if the scene gets quiet, all the quiet sounds start to come up. Right. And it's just one of those things that your ear naturally does when you're in a quiet environment, but cameras do it as well. It's something we're all kind of used to. So that was one of the things that makes that scene feel quiet is that we're amplifying the quiet sounds, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it kind of does. Well, obviously, this is a sound team that has a lot of experience on big sci-fi movies. But Jake, prior to Alien Romulus, I don't think you had much experience with sci-fi stuff and aliens. Was there anything you noticed in regards to the VFX process that either impacted you as the editor or taught you new things you hadn't done before?
Yeah, I mean, I've done, like even real world films these days involve more visual effects than you'd imagine. And then the film I'd just done prior was Civil War, which had a fair amount of visual effects. But no, I'd never done sort of space and thing. I mean, definitely one of the more, and yeah, having said all that, this film had more to work with in camera than, for example, a film like the end of Civil War. There was a hell of a lot less on set than we had on this film in terms of representing what was actually going to be there in the final thing for certain sequences. So, there weren't that many scenes where you had to use all your, too much of your imagination to work out what was going on. But the thing that, was probably quite unique is I worked with Fede, who cut his teeth. He made a short film, a very visual effects heavy short film when he was a kid in Uruguay. And so he can do all this stuff himself. And, so when we were first putting the first director's cut together, we'd have a scene like say inside the Corbett, and then it would, the script would say exterior space shot approaches the station, and yet there was nothing there at that stage at all. I just written it on the screen, and Fede was, he and I together would compose the shots in the edit suite, and within 20 minutes he could put together a grayscale version of the shot and choose his lenses and the camera move, and then give me an export within 20 minutes, half an hour. And so we were able to sort of literally build these sequences live together. And, it was slightly slower than real time, but really we could then go back and say, we need the other shot here. Whereas if you're trying to do that process with ILM down a phone line to the other side of, the world, it's a much more, it was a much more immediate process with Fede, because he was cutting out like 4 stages of middlemen, which I don't think, that's pretty unique. That was a pretty unique experience on this one. But in terms of, the other stuff, it's usually the same sort of thing, but in this instance, we had, the monsters generally were there. There was a lot to work with. So it was, a good experience.
So I have a ton more questions to ask you, but I'm not that bad a guy, so I'm not going to. I'm going to let you go because you've been working so hard on this movie, and now either you got a break, you're back hard at work on another one. So thank you all for taking the time to do this, and I know I speak for everybody out there when I say get going on the sequel.
We can't wait.